You know how some people joke about being the family bank? For me, it wasn't a joke. It was my life. For 5 years, I'd been the unofficial treasurer of my sister Melissa's existence, covering her rent, utilities, groceries, and even the occasional splurge for her daughter, Ellie. All this, while working a blue-collar job where overtime wasn't a perk. It was a necessity. Melissa wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, she had a husband and a semblance of stability. But when her temper proved too much for him to handle, he walked out, leaving her with a pile of bills and a toddler. That's when the family baton of responsibility got handed to me. Our parents, basking in their retirement golden years, made it clear they had no intention of stepping in. "You're young and capable, John," Mum had said when I brought it up. "You can handle it." So, I handled it. I tightened my belt, worked extra shifts, and put my own dreams on hold, all to make sure Melissa and Ellie didn't go without. I told myself it was the right thing to do. After all, who else was going to help them? But then, a year ago, Melissa got a decent job. Nothing glamorous, but it came with a salary, benefits, and a chance to finally get back on her feet. I figured I'd help out a little longer while she adjusted. But as the months went by, I noticed something unsettling. Melissa wasn't struggling anymore. At family dinners, she'd casually mention her latest shopping spree or the new gadget she'd bought for Ellie. At first, I kept quiet, telling myself maybe she deserved a little fun after everything she'd been through. But last week, she pushed me too far. We were at Mum and Dad's house for dinner. Me, Melissa, Ellie, our parents, and Uncle Rob. The meal was the usual chaos, Ellie refusing to eat her vegetables while Mum and Dad reminisced about their latest cruise. Then, Melissa dropped a bomb. "I'm thinking about buying this amazing purse," she said, showing a photo on her phone. "It's only $500, but it's designer." I paused mid-bite, trying to process her words. "You're thinking about spending $500 on a purse while I'm still paying your rent?" I asked, keeping my tone calm but firm. Her response? She laughed. "Oh, don't be so cheap, John." Something inside me snapped. 5 years of sacrifice, of giving up vacations, nights out, and things I wanted, all for her, and I was cheap. I put down my fork, my appetite gone. "Cheap?" I repeated, my voice cold. "Let's talk about cheap, Melissa. Like how I've been covering your rent while you buy purses. Or how I've sacrificed everything while you pretend you're struggling. You know what? I'm done." The room went silent. Mum and Dad suddenly found their mashed potatoes fascinating, while Melissa stared at me in disbelief. "What do you mean, done?" she asked, her tone incredulous. "I mean no more rent, no more groceries, no more handouts," I said, standing up. "You're on your own." Uncle Rob leaned back in his chair and gave a low whistle. "Way to go, John," he said, clapping me on the back. "You don't owe anyone anything." Melissa spluttered, trying to form a response, but I didn't wait. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, pausing only to add, "And if you think this is temporary anger, you're wrong. It's time for you to grow up, Melissa." I left, my heart pounding in my chest. Relief and anger fought for dominance as I drove home. 5 years of being the family bank, and this was how I was treated. Little did I know, the fallout from that dinner was only the beginning, and what came next would test me more than I ever thought possible. The silence from Melissa was unnerving. Days passed, then a week, and I didn't hear a word from her. No angry texts, no guilt-tripping voicemails, nothing. It felt too quiet, like the calm before a storm. I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing, but the nagging thought that something was brewing kept me on edge, that something arrived late one night, in the form of a knock at my door. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to see my parents standing there, their expressions a mix of annoyance and self-righteous indignation. "We need to talk about Melissa," Mum said without preamble, stepping inside as if invited. Dad followed, closing the door behind him. I crossed my arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Do we? Because I think I've said everything I need to." "She's struggling, John," Dad added, his tone heavy with disappointment. "Ellie doesn't deserve to suffer because of your stubbornness." I couldn't help but laugh, though it wasn't out of humour. "Let me get this straight. You two, who have spent the last 5 years on cruises and at wine tastings, want to lecture me about family responsibility. When exactly did you decide to care?" "That's not fair," Mom snapped, her face flushing. "We're retired. You're young and capable." "And she's your daughter," I shot back, my frustration bubbling over. Funny how she's suddenly my responsibility now that you don't feel like dealing with it. The conversation spiraled from there, a familiar dance of guilt and blame. Mom's voice rose as she lectured me about family loyalty. Dad sighed heavily, shaking his head like I was a disappointment. "You're being cold, John," Mom finally said, her voice tinged with accusation. "This isn't like you." "Maybe not," I replied, walking to the door and holding it open. "But it's how I'm going to be from now on. Thanks for stopping by." They left grumbling, but I felt a strange sense of relief. For once, I'd stood my ground. That relief lasted exactly 2 days. Melissa called me out of the blue. I debated not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I asked, skipping pleasantries. Her tone was strangely light. "Just wanted to let you know I'm moving out of the apartment next month." "Why?" I frowned. "Can't afford it without me." "Oh, I can afford it," she said, her voice smug. "I just don't want to. I'm moving back in with Mom and Dad." That hit me like a punch to the gut. "What?" "They offered," she said casually, as if it were no big deal. "They said they didn't want Ellie to suffer because of your little tantrum. So I'm putting my stuff in storage and moving into the guest room. Should be cozy." I couldn't find the words. The image of Melissa lounging at my parents' house, rent-free, responsibility-free, while they made excuses for her, was almost too much to process. "Oh, and one more thing," she added, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You might want to check your credit report. Just a heads up." My stomach dropped. "What the hell does that mean?" She laughed. "You'll find out. Bye, Johnny." I hung up and immediately logged into my credit account. What I saw made my blood run cold. There it was, a new credit card account in my name, with a balance that made my head spin. Thousands of dollars charged to stores I'd never shopped at, all opened in the last 6 months. Melissa hadn't just been taking my money. She'd been stealing my identity. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. Anger, disbelief, and betrayal swirled in my chest. Helping her was one thing. Being played for a fool was something else entirely. This wasn't just about cutting her off anymore. This was war. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I had been grappling with the fallout from discovering Melissa's credit card fraud, spending hours on the phone with the credit card companies and a lawyer. I filed a police report, not because I wanted to, but because the lawyer told me I needed to protect myself. I knew it would escalate things, but Melissa had left me no choice. Then came the bombshell. I was at work, trying to focus on a project, when my phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Rob. It read, "Did you know your parents took out a loan? Thought you should hear it from me." I felt a chill creep down my spine. A loan? For what? When I called Uncle Rob, he didn't mince words. "They're paying off the rest of Melissa's debt," he said bluntly. "She went crying to them after you cut her off, and they decided to bail her out. They took a loan against the house to do it." My jaw clenched. "You've got to be kidding me." "I wish I was," Rob replied. "They didn't want you to find out, but I figured you deserved to know." I hung up, my blood boiling. They had gone behind my back, enabling Melissa yet again, and risking their own financial stability to do it. Worse, they were still expecting me to stay quiet and pick up the pieces when it all fell apart. That evening, I drove straight to my parents' house. When I walked in, they were sitting in the living room with Melissa, laughing like everything was fine. As soon as they saw me, the mood shifted. "John," Mom said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" "I'm here because I just found out about the loan," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Care to explain?" Mom's face paled, but Dad stood up, his expression stern. "We did what we had to do," he said. "Ellie doesn't deserve to suffer because of your stubbornness." "And what about you?" I demanded, pointing at Melissa. "What's your excuse this time? Stealing my identity wasn't enough?" Melissa crossed her arms, her tone defiant. "I did what I had to do, John. You cut me off. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to grow up," I snapped. "But instead you ran back here and dragged them down with you. And you," I said, turning to my parents. "You let her. You're willing to jeopardize your own future just to enable her lies and manipulation. Do you even hear yourselves? We're protecting our family," Mum said sharply. "No, you're enabling her," I shot back. "And I'm done being a part of it." "Don't you dare walk out on this family," Dad yelled as I turned toward the door. I stopped and looked back at all of them, my heart pounding in my chest. "You already walked out on me the moment you decided my sacrifices didn't matter," I've been your scapegoat long enough. From now on, you can clean up your own messes. Melissa smirked. You'll be back, John. You always come back. I met her gaze, my voice cold. Not this time. I walked out, slamming the door behind me. My phone buzzed with angry texts from my parents and Melissa for the rest of the night, but I ignored them all. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by their demands. I wasn't their bank, their fixer, or their fool anymore. I was free. This wasn't just defiance, it was liberation. And I had no intention of looking back. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of walking out of my parents' house, the family group chat blew up. Message after message from my parents and Melissa filled the screen, each one more dramatic than the last. Mom, you're tearing this family apart, John. Dad, we raised you to be better than this. Melissa, Ellie is heartbroken. You're a selfish coward. I put my phone down, my jaw tight, and went for a walk. The night was crisp and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in my head. I felt raw, part angry, part sad, part relieved. For years I'd carried the weight of my family's expectations, and now that I'd finally dropped it, I didn't know what to do with myself. The next day, I received an unexpected call from Uncle Rob. Heard about what happened, he said gruffly. Good for you, kid. Someone needed to stand up to them. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Thanks, Rob. I don't feel like the hero right now. You're not the hero, he said bluntly. You're just the only one with any sense. His words gave me a flicker of validation. Still, the days that followed were tough. My parents stopped calling, but the silence wasn't comforting. I knew they were fuming, and I knew it wasn't over. Melissa, however, wasn't as quiet. She took to social media, posting vague but pointed messages. It's sad when the people who are supposed to love you the most are the first to abandon you. And my favourite, family is supposed to be forever. Guess not for everyone. The real breaking point came a week later when my parents invited me over for dinner. Against my better judgment, I went. Maybe I still hoped there was a chance for reconciliation. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Melissa was already there, sitting at the table with a smug expression. Ellie was nowhere to be seen. We need to talk, Dad started, his tone heavy. About how I'm the bad guy? I asked, sitting down. About how you've handled this, Mum said, her voice sharp. You didn't have to humiliate Melissa or threaten her with the police. She committed fraud, I said, my voice rising. What did you expect me to do? Clap and say, great job, sis? You could have handled it privately, Dad snapped. You didn't have to escalate things. Privately, I scoffed. You mean quietly? So no one would see how you've enabled her for years? Melissa finally spoke up, her voice dripping with indignation. You're just bitter because I didn't need you anymore. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. You've never needed me, Melissa. You've just used me, and now you've dragged them down with you. John, Mum said, her voice softening, please, for Ellie's sake. This isn't about Ellie, I interrupted. This is about you refusing to let her face the consequences of her actions, and I'm done being a part of it. I left without looking back. That night, I sat on my couch, replaying the confrontation in my head. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it was all there. But so was something else, a sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their burdens. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my life. I started going to the gym again, reconnecting with friends, and focusing on work. Uncle Rob and I grabbed dinner one night, and he told me how proud he was of me. You're finally living for yourself, he said. About damn time. It wasn't easy. The guilt lingered, especially when Ellie called me one evening, asking why I didn't come around anymore. I assured her I loved her, and would always be there for her, no matter what. But my resolve didn't waver. I'd learned a hard lesson. Family doesn't mean sacrificing your happiness, your boundaries, or your dignity. Sometimes, love means walking away. And as the days turned into weeks, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. In the months that followed, my life transformed in ways I never expected. At first, the silence from my parents and Melissa was deafening. For years I had been their safety net, their go-to problem solver, their bank. Now, I was just me. The absence of their constant demands felt strange, but it also left room for something I hadn't had in a long time. Peace. I began filling my days with things that brought me joy. I joined a recreational basketball league, something I'd put off for years because of work and family obligations. I finally took a weekend trip to the mountains, a dream I'd shelved so many times it had started to feel like a fantasy. Standing at the edge of a quiet lake, with no one texting me about bills or rent, or guilt-tripping me into fixing their problems, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Work became a source of pride again. Without the cloud of family drama hanging over me, I poured my energy into a new project at the company and earned a promotion within 3 months. My co-workers noticed the change too. "You seem lighter," one of them said during a team lunch. "Like you're finally breathing." They were right. I was breathing, for the first time in years. Uncle Rob, my ever-reliable sounding board, remained a steadfast presence in my life. Over a steak dinner one night, he raised a glass and grinned. "Here's to you, kid, for finally learning how to say no." I laughed, but his words stuck with me. Saying no had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Melissa, of course, continued to play the victim. From what I heard through the grapevine, she was still living at my parents' house, still leaning on them for support, and still avoiding responsibility. Mum and Dad's frustration grew over time, but their pride kept them from admitting they'd made a mistake. The real surprise came from Ellie. One afternoon, she called me from her mom's phone. "Uncle John," she said softly, "can I come visit you? Mum says you're mad at us, but I miss you." Hearing her voice broke my heart a little, but it also gave me hope. "Of course you can visit," I said gently. "You're always welcome here." She came over the following weekend, and we spent the day baking cookies, watching movies, and talking about school. When she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "Thanks for being my favorite uncle." That moment reminded me why I'd fought so hard to draw boundaries. It wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about showing Ellie what self-respect looked like. The lesson I learned was simple but profound. Standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Family doesn't mean being a doormat. It means respect, support, and mutual care. And when those things are missing, it's okay to walk away. The distance from my family wasn't easy, but it gave me the space to build a life I could be proud of. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. One evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset, I realized something important. I hadn't lost a family. I'd gained myself, and that was a trade I'd make again in a heartbeat. Story 2. The shimmering white dress hung in my closet, a cruel mockery of the life I thought I was about to have. 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my fiancé, Alex, vanished. It started innocently enough. I woke up one morning, and he was simply gone. No note, no text, no whispered "I love you" before slipping out the door. Just an empty space beside me in bed and a chilling silence in our apartment. Panic clawed at my throat. I called his cell 1,000 times, each unanswered ring a hammer blow to my dwindling hope. I texted, I emailed, I scoured social media for any sign of life. Nothing. His family was just as clueless. His mum, bless her heart, tried to soothe my anxieties, but her trembling voice betrayed her own fear. Days bled into an agonizing eternity. I was a hollow shell, functioning on autopilot, the wedding plans I'd poured my heart and soul into, now a grotesque monument to a love that seemed to have evaporated. Then, a cruel twist of fate. One of his friends, oblivious to the turmoil, posted a picture on Instagram. A group of guys, beers in hand, grinning at the camera in some Spanish bar. Alex, front and center, looking carefree and utterly unburdened. Rage, hot and consuming, surged through me. He was on some impromptu bachelor party, living it up in Spain, while I was here, drowning in worry and heartbreak. I fired off a furious text, demanding an explanation, threatening to call off the wedding if he didn't get on the next flight home. He finally called back, but instead of the groveling apology I craved, he offered excuses. His friends had planned it, he whined. They'd already paid for everything. It would be rude to back out. He tried to call me, but his phone was acting up. "Rude?" I spat, my voice shaking. "You disappear without a word, 2 weeks before our wedding, and you're worried about being rude to your friends?" He didn't get it. He simply didn't grasp the magnitude of his betrayal. He went on about how he deserved to have life experiences before settling down. How he'd been with me since we were practically kids. Life experiences? I scoffed. What about our life together? What about the vows you were about to make? The conversation spiraled. He refused to come home, insisting he'd be back a few days before the wedding. Deal with it, he'd said, his voice cold, before hanging up. Deal with it. How could I possibly deal with this gaping wound in my heart, this shattering of trust? I tried to reason with him, to appeal to his sense of responsibility, to remind him of the life we were building together. But it was like talking to a brick wall. He was lost in his own selfish desires, blinded by the allure of a carefree boys' trip. After days of agonizing silence, I made the hardest decision of my life. With trembling fingers, I sent out messages to our friends and family, cancelling the wedding. I dealt with the vendors, the caterers, the florist, the avalanche of logistical nightmares that came crashing down with the force of a tidal wave. My parents pleaded with me to reconsider, to wait for him to come back, to talk it through. But the pain was too raw, the betrayal too deep. I couldn't bear the thought of facing him, of seeing the indifference in his eyes, the lack of remorse for the devastation he'd caused. I was done. Our 6 years together, the dreams we'd shared, the future we'd planned. It all crumbled to dust in the wake of his selfish, reckless decision. The days leading up to the would-be wedding were a blur of grief and anger. I moved through life in a daze, the well-wishes and condolences from friends and family a constant reminder of what I'd lost. My apartment, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, now felt like a tomb. Every corner held a memory, a ghost of the life that was supposed to be. Alex finally returned, a few days before the non-existent wedding, acting surprised and indignant that there was no celebration to come home to. He showed up at my door, a bouquet of wilted flowers in hand, expecting forgiveness. I refused to let him in. You made your choice, Alex, I said through the closed door, my voice trembling. Now you have to live with the consequences. He pleaded, he begged, he swore he'd do anything to make things right. But the words rang hollow. How could I trust him again after he so carelessly discarded our relationship? He finally left. His shoulders slumped, the echo of his retreating footsteps a haunting melody in the empty hallway. The guilt gnawed at me. His parents called, their voices thick with worry, telling me how devastated he was, how he refused to eat, how he spent his days locked in his room, replaying his mistakes. My own parents, though initially supportive, started to waver. Don't you think you're being a bit harsh? My mum ventured one day, her voice laced with concern. Maybe you should talk to him. Give him a chance to explain. Explain what? I retorted, the anger flaring again. How he prioritized a boy's trip over our future. How he thought he could just waltz back in and expect everything to be okay. The guilt warred with the anger, a constant tug-of-war in my soul. Had I overreacted? Was I throwing away 6 years of love over a stupid mistake? But then I would remember the coldness in his voice when he told me to deal with it, the utter lack of empathy for my pain. And the resolve would solidify. I deserved better than someone who could so easily dismiss my feelings, who valued his own fleeting desires over our shared dreams. The messages started pouring in. Friends, some well-meaning, some oblivious, forwarded me Alex's apologies. He was so sorry, they said. He realized his mistake. He wanted to marry me, even if it wasn't the grand celebration we'd planned. He just wanted to be with me. Each message was a fresh wound, a reminder of the love I'd lost, the future I'd envisioned. I blocked his number, deleted his emails, tried to erase every trace of him from my life. But the memories lingered, like phantom limbs, a constant ache in my heart. The day of the would-be wedding dawned, a cruel parody of what should have been. I woke up to a barrage of texts, congratulations, well wishes, questions about the venue, the dress, the honeymoon, each one a knife twisting in my gut. I spent the day in a fog, wandering aimlessly through the city, trying to escape the suffocating weight of what should have been. The image of Alex, grinning in that Spanish bar, haunted me. Had he even thought of me that day? Had he spared a single moment of regret for the life he'd thrown away? As the sun set, casting long shadows across the cityscape, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. I was tired of fighting, tired of hurting, tired of the endless cycle of guilt and anger. I just wanted to move on, to find a way to heal, to reclaim my life. Healing, I discovered, was a long and arduous journey. It was a winding path through grief, anger, and acceptance, with unexpected detours and setbacks along the way. I threw myself into work, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of deadlines and deliverables. I reconnected with old friends, their laughter and support a lifeline in the choppy waters of my emotions. I started therapy, tentatively at first, then with growing trust and vulnerability. Slowly, the sharp edges of pain began to soften. The anger subsided, replaced by a quiet sadness for what could have been. The guilt lessened, as I realized that I wasn't to blame for Alex's choices. One evening, months after the cancelled wedding, I found myself scrolling through old photos. Pictures of Alex and me, smiling and carefree, ghosts of a happier time. A wave of nostalgia washed over me, not for Alex himself, but for the person I was then, the love I felt, the dreams we shared. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't about condoning his actions, but about freeing myself from the shackles of resentment. It was about acknowledging the pain, honoring the love that was lost, and letting go of the bitterness that was poisoning my soul. I wrote him a letter, not an apology, nor a reconciliation, but a farewell. I poured out my hurt, my anger, my disappointment. But I also thanked him for the good times, for the memories, for the lessons learned. I wished him well, truly, and released him from my heart. I never sent the letter. It wasn't meant for him, not really. It was for me. A way to close the chapter, to say goodbye to the ghost of our past, to make peace with the woman I was becoming. Life moved on. I found new love, a love built on trust and respect, a love that celebrated my strength and independence. We built a life together, a life filled with laughter and adventure, a life that honored the scars of the past while embracing the promise of the future. Years later, I ran into Alex. It was a chance encounter at a coffee shop, a fleeting moment of recognition across a crowded room. He looked older, a little weary, the youthful arrogance replaced by a quiet sadness. We exchanged a few polite words, the ghost of our past hovering between us. There were no apologies, no recriminations, just a quiet acknowledgement of the shared history that had shaped us both. As I walked away, a sense of peace settled over me. I had moved on, truly moved on. The pain was a distant memory, the scars a testament to my resilience. I had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for my own. And as I stepped back into the sunshine, I knew that the journey had been worth it. I had emerged from the ashes of heartbreak, stronger and wiser, ready to embrace the fullness of life, with all its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and defeats. The cancelled wedding, the betrayal, the pain. It had all been a catalyst for growth, a crucible that forged a new and stronger version of myself. And for that I was grateful.